On Plugged In, a show of unity at the NATO summit in London. Leaders of 29 member countries discussing emerging global security challenges and the future of the North Atlantic Treaty. But amid the handshakes, nagging questions about America's commitment to Europe's collective security.
I got NATO to pay an extra $100 billion they weren't paying.
And the reliability of a U.S. president under investigation at home. Is NATO still necessary? And is the principle of mutual defense still the best strategy for peace? Plugged In looks at the future of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on NATO at 70. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Mil Arcega, filling in for Greta Van Susteren. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949 after the Second World War to provide mutual defense for member countries against the threat of communism, turned 70 this year. 29 nations make up the NATO alliance, soon to be 30 with the addition of Macedonia. But the anniversary got off to a difficult start this week as leaders of the United States, France, and Turkey clashed over burden sharing and the future direction of the alliance. Henry Ridgwell reports from London.
NATO leaders attended a reception hosted by the Queen at Buckingham Palace Tuesday night, a cordial end to a fiery first day. US President Donald Trump and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron clashed on the fate of foreign Islamic State fighters being held in Syria.
Many are from France, many are from Germany, many are from UK. They're mostly from Europe. And some of the countries are agreeing. I have not spoken to the president about that. Would you like some nice ISIS fighters?
Yeah.
I can give them. You can take everyone you want.
Let's be serious. The very large number of fighters you have on the ground are ISIS fighters coming from Syria, from Iraq, and the region.
Macron said he stood by his brain-dead comments and reiterated criticism of Turkey.
When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us, shoulder to shoulder against ISIS. And sometimes they work with ISIS forces.
Trump said pressure from the US meant NATO members were now spending more on defense, and the alliance should tackle multiple threats.
A lot of people say it was meant to look at originally the Soviet Union, now Russia, but we also have other things to look at, whether it's radical Islamic terrorism, whether it's the tremendous growth of China.
Tensions within NATO threaten to boil over. Last month, Turkey ignored NATO objections and launched an offensive in northern Syria against Kurdish fighters. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Tuesday he would oppose NATO's plan to defend the Baltic states against Russia unless the alliance recognizes those Kurdish fighters as terrorists. Analysts say NATO is suffering from a clash of personalities.
This summit has the three presidents problem. President Trump, President Macron, and President Erdogan. And the challenge for the institution is celebrating NATO's 70th anniversary without one of those three presidents driving the whole thing off the rails.
Compounding NATO tensions, Turkey this year purchased the Russian S-400 missile defense system and recently tested it against its own American-made F-16 jets. NATO's Secretary General insists the alliance is in good health.
We have just implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation since the end of the Cold War.
Many delegates in London question whether the tensions are just a clash of personalities or whether NATO has deeper problems.
So is it simply a clash of personalities and different agendas, or are NATO's problems more structural in nature? Well, to help us out with that, we are joined by Henry Ridgwell, VOA senior correspondent in London. Welcome back to Plugged In, Henry. That was a good report. Henry,
Good to be with you, Mil.
Yeah, it appears that clash between President Trump and the French president was maybe just the tip of the iceberg. It seems other world leaders, notably the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was also caught on video talking about Mr. Trump behind his back. Has there been any reaction? Has Mr. Trump weighed in?
He has indeed. You heard the three presidents problem mentioned in that report: President Trump, President Macron, and President Erdogan of Turkey. Now you can throw in a fourth, Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada, who was caught on camera this morning at a gathering before the official summit started, telling an anecdote about Donald Trump. First of all, he appeared to be talking or bemoaning the fact that Donald Trump was late because he had held an impromptu press conference. Then he told an anecdote which wasn't quite picked up by the microphones, and then he appeared to say that you could see Donald Trump's team's jaws hit the floor when he made some announcement. It's not exactly clear what Justin Trudeau was talking about, but generally there was laughter. It appeared to be that Donald Trump was being made fun of. And Donald Trump has responded in the last couple of hours. He called in a press conference Justin Trudeau two-faced, and he said the reason why he may have made those comments is because Canada has not been paying its 2% of GDP spending targets on defence. So while NATO made an effort at the end there to have the handshakes, to have the smiles for the 70th anniversary celebrations, there's always something, isn't there, that can upset the cart?
Isn't there? It seems to me a new low, at least for a leader summit. But what appears clear right now is that our UN allies appear to be prepared and standing up to Mr. Trump. I'm wondering, what is the perception of Mr. Trump overseas? Are the impeachment hearings here in Washington affecting his credibility and perhaps his influence among leaders there at the UN summit?
I think leaders, certainly here in London at the NATO meeting, are being very cautious. Sorry, but just saying, I think the leaders here in London at the NATO meeting are being very cautious about that. It's certainly bad form to talk about the domestic problems of a president, particularly when he's not on his home territory. But also, I think they are following the impeachment hearings very closely, and also the lead up to the 2020 presidential election. And it's clear that it's quite possible that the other leaders in NATO could be dealing possibly with another 4 years of a President Trump in the White House. So nobody wants to burn any bridges here, but it's clear that something has been caught off mic here that may have caused a minor incident in NATO. We await to see what Donald Trump's reaction will be when he gets back to Washington later tonight. Everybody, I guess, will have their eyes on Twitter.
Yeah, for sure. We will be too. But last question for you, Henry. Mr. Trump seems to be showing a lot more deference to Turkey's President Erdogan. Does that tell you a little bit about, does that give us any clues about some of the tensions surrounding this summit?
It does. President Trump had a bilateral meeting with President Erdogan this afternoon, and he was asked specifically about what was talked about there. President Trump praised the Turks for securing that border with Syria. He said that the withdrawal of American troops from northern Syria had been a success, and that it was time that those troops came home, and that their own country's troops patrolled that border. So that would seem to be a rejection of French President Emmanuel Macron's criticism of the Turkish role in northern Syria and their targeting of Kurdish troops there. Don't forget, many of those Kurdish fighters fought alongside Western coalition troops to take on Islamic State. So there does certainly seem to be some differences of opinion over Turkey's role in NATO. I think where President Trump has held common ground, even with President Macron at this summit, is on Turkey's purchase of a Russian-made missile defense system, the S-400, which it has tested against American-made F-16 jets. And that, for a NATO member to be buying Russian military equipment, really has caused many problems here at the summit. But that isn't the only problem. I think the last thing to say about this summit, though, is that many people have praised the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, for holding together all of these 29 leaders despite all of those differences. And his point at the end was that, well, the disagreements will always make greater news because we live in free democratic societies. And that's what NATO is here to defend.
Thank you for your reporting. Henry Ridgwell, our correspondent in London. Well, with a growing threat of terrorism and another Cold War looming, is NATO ready to respond if needed? And does NATO have the full support of its most important member, the United States? VOA's White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara is covering the U.S. president and filed this report from the NATO summit in London.
Fighting continues in northeastern Syria following Turkey's invasion of Kurdish-held territory. President Donald Trump ordered American forces to leave in October without consulting NATO allies.
It's exactly in the wake of that decision that you had President Macron say what he said about the alliance being brain dead and referencing the lack of American leadership in the sense of leading a community and not just going out on your own.
Meanwhile, a simmering war between Russia and Ukraine has become the backdrop of Trump's impeachment. The two conflicts in Europe's eastern and southern flank further complicate Washington's already strained relations with other NATO members. Donald Trump, who no longer publicly says that the alliance is obsolete and wants to leave it, continues to slam member countries for not meeting NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target. American officials have reassured European leaders of Washington's continued commitment, as shown by military reinforcement in NATO's eastern flank. But anxiety persists that under Trump, the U.S. is neglecting the alliance.
Some of them hoping that Trump will be out of office, in a year's time. So the real fear is that Trump wins a second term.
Across Europe, responses differ. Paris is touting strategic autonomy, that Europe should take care of their own security. Warsaw is promoting a strategic embrace, developing close bilateral relationship with Trump to guarantee its own security.
And then you have Germany in the middle, which is, I think, a little bit divided between sort of Atlanticists on the one hand, who do believe in NATO and believe that NATO continues to be how the security of Europe should be guaranteed. And then on the other hand, post-Atlanticists who are sort of more on the French side of this argument. Europeans are very much arguing about that.
Just days before the summit, NATO announced it had agreed to redistribute costs and reduce Washington's contribution to its relatively small central budget, a move aimed at placating Trump.
And for more on the issues and the backstory surrounding this historic summit, we caught up with VOA's White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara on assignment there in London. I spoke with her earlier about whether the impeachment hearings in Washington have overshadowed President Trump's meetings with world leaders. She also discussed the various security and economic issues that each leader brings to the table.
So for European leaders, the big issues include terrorism, particularly the potential resurgence of ISIS after the withdrawal of American forces from northeastern Syria in October, which President Trump did without consulting NATO allies, as well as the fear or the concerns over Russia. Not just Russian expansionism as what they've done in Crimea, but also the Russian election meddling, which is a big issue here in the UK as they head into their elections on December 12th. Now, those are European concerns, but for President Trump and the US, the big issues include China and trying to pressure European allies not to include China in the building of their 5G networks, as well as continuing the pressure on Iran. As we know, there are 9 European countries so far who have joined Instex. This is a system, a mechanism, a barter mechanism that's designed specifically to circumvent U.S. sanctions as it avoids the use of the dollar. And the other big issue, of course, Mil, is burden sharing. This is something that President Trump has continuously pressured European leaders to fulfill the 2% target of GDP for defense spending for NATO. Currently, only 9 of the member countries, 9 out of the 29 member countries have met or exceeded this target.
In all this happening at a very complicated time for the President of the United States, he's being challenged at home with the prospect of impeachment, his credibility in question in Europe.
So on the issue of impeachment, I think out of politeness, European leaders, NATO leaders are largely avoiding that question, at least publicly, for President Trump. And I should note that President Trump is not the first U.S. president who comes into a NATO summit under the cloud of impeachment. In 1974, Richard Nixon, on the 25th anniversary of NATO, also came to a NATO summit. This was in June, and then several weeks later, he was, of course, removed from office, or he resigned from office. So I think perhaps the similarities there are that both presidents come perhaps a little bit distracted with these domestic pressures from home, but both try to project a sense of normalcy. In terms of how European leaders are facing President Trump after his third year in office, I think the views are quite divergent across Europe. In Paris, you have Macron, who is advocating the strategic autonomy view that Europe must take care of its own security and not rely so much on the U.S. Meanwhile, from Poland, President Duda, we know, very much closely aligned to President Trump, and he's advocating what's called a strategic embrace. Meanwhile, Germany is somewhat in the middle, advocating a strategic patience, a kind of wait-and-see approach to see whether or not President Trump will become re-elected. And this is, of course, another fear in Europe as they see the U.S. gradually withdrawing from its commitment to Europe. There is a sense of crisis that if President Trump gets re-elected, then the withdrawal of the U.S. commitment from Europe will become more cemented.
Does the president still believe that NATO is not quite as effective as it should be, and why?
He has not publicly said that NATO is obsolete, but he has still often complaints about inequitable burden sharing, particularly during his rallies. This has become like a familiar theme for President Trump. So going ahead, this is something that NATO as an alliance will have to deal with how to stay relevant and how to stay effective in the midst of all these internal and external challenges. And for this purpose, there is a German and Franco proposal to put together a group of what they call respected figures of experts to discuss and advise NATO on what can be done in the future to guarantee the longevity and also relevance of this alliance.
Patsy, NATO represents a safety net for about 1 billion people around the world. Is it still an effective safety net against outside hostile forces?
Well, yes, that's something that NATO really wished to project in the future, is this idea of military coherence, despite there is internal political threat. I mean, it's still the most well-organized, most well-funded, and the most, basically, most militarized pact or treaty or alliance in the world. So in terms of military coherence, if they can go forward and prove that they can overcome their own internal strife, this is certainly a force that should still be reckoned with.
And that was White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara. Well, after this NATO summit, the leaders of Russia and Ukraine will meet face-to-face for the first time in Paris. Germany's Angela Merkel and France's Emmanuel Macron will be there as well. Ukraine is not a NATO member, but it is pivotal to NATO's security interests because of its location as a buffer of sorts between NATO and Russia. But it is a buffer that's been at war with Russian-backed rebels for the last 5 years. Charles Maines explains from Moscow.
For 5 years, Ukrainian's government has been locked in a grinding battle with pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, with more than 13,000 Ukrainians killed. Over that period, the Kremlin has maintained it is not part of a war in which Russian soldiers, rebranded as volunteers, have joined in the fighting, while European powers have repeatedly tried and failed to negotiate an end to the violence. Against that backdrop enters a newcomer, Volodymyr Zelensky. A comedic actor made famous for a role playing an accidental Ukrainian president on TV, Zelensky won the real thing in a landslide election victory earlier this year, his central promise to voters to end the war in East Ukraine. Russian analysts say the Kremlin has taken note.
He promised peace. That was one of the most important points in his election campaign, and he tries to deliver. So we see a new flexibility on the Ukrainian side, which allowed to reach a couple of significant agreements on specific issues.
Successes include a mass prisoner exchange that took place this past September. And then last month, Russia returned 3 Ukrainian naval ships it had seized a year prior, a gesture that turned sour after Kiev accused Moscow of stripping the vessels into disrepair. Still, Russian polls indicate a Zelensky effect, as Russian attitudes hardened by state propaganda demonizing Ukraine have begun to soften.
He's just a very popular figure here in Russia. He played in those television games in Moscow some years ago. So he's just, and his image is better as opposing to the previous president. So he's just more friendly, more open.
There were millions of people in Russia who saw these performances in movies and who loved that, who laughed at his jokes. He's funny. And an enemy shouldn't be funny. An enemy should be frightening, should be scary. And Zelensky is not.
But the laughs don't extend to Donbass, with Ukraine still looking to regain control over territory lost to pro-Russian rebels, and Russia insisting on special status for, and perhaps influence over, independent republics not even Moscow recognizes. Meanwhile, Zelensky faces other political challenges. His efforts to make peace with Moscow have alienated militant forces at home, while his cameo role in the impeachment hearings in Washington has put U.S. support for Ukraine in question just when Zelensky needs it most. Given the complexities, both sides are hinting an agreement to deliver Russian oil and gas through Ukraine to Europe may prove the easiest deliverable for these Paris peace talks. It's a smaller but important step towards rebuilding trust, and a tacit acknowledgement that Ukraine and Russia remain locked as neighbors, whether they like it or not. Charles Maines for VOA News, Moscow.
So why does Ukraine matter? And are NATO leaders closer to solving the Russia-Ukraine imbroglio? What are the current threats, challenges facing NATO as the alliance celebrates its 70-year anniversary? Well, joining us now to share her insight and her expertise is Heather Conley. Ms. Conley is Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, where she heads the Europe and Eurasia program. She also served in the U.S. State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and she was formerly Executive Director of the American Red Cross. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Conley.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Ms. Conley, how central is this whole Ukraine conundrum to the security of NATO member countries?
So in many ways, NATO's security begins in Ukraine. And it's really been Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its military incursions into eastern Ukraine in 2014 that really transformed NATO. And the summit that the alliance held in Wales in 2014 was the summit that repositioned NATO, reinforced NATO's eastern flank and placing 4 NATO battalions in the 3 Baltic states and Poland, as well as reinforcements in southern Europe. It was transformative for Europe to spend more on its own defense. And what we saw today in the declaration that came from the London leaders meeting was, in fact, again, a reaffirmation that one of NATO's most important purposes is to protect NATO members from potential Russian aggression. I do have to say, Ukraine has been an extraordinary laboratory for Russian hybrid tactics, and these are tactics that the U.S. and other NATO allies are studying, are trying to understand, and of course build resilience toward, and of course defer further types of these hybrid activities. But it's extremely important, and I think some ways the impeachment inquiry here in the United States has diminished Ukraine's strategic importance to NATO, to Europe, to the United States.
So we're hearing a lot of affirmation from NATO leaders, but are we going to see any results as a result of the summit meeting? And I'm wondering, I mean, how is Vladimir Putin seeing all of this as it's going on in London?
What is very difficult, and what you're seeing, I like to divide it into two. What you see is the noise, and then there's the work. So I'm going to focus on the work, and then I'll talk a little bit about the noise. Mm-hmm. The work is really found, and again, this was a meeting. It wasn't a formal summit. This was an opportunity for the leaders to gather to commemorate 70 years of NATO, which in itself is a historic accomplishment, but really it's about the alliance looking towards its next 70 years. So this declaration focuses on the fact that NATO members have now substantially increase their defense spending. And President Trump highlighted this, in fact, before he left for this trip and on the trip. So NATO is making important headway to strengthen its own defense. The alliance talked about future challenges, emerging technologies, 5G, artificial intelligence. And of course, that is connected to the challenge that China is posing towards Europe and the United States, and understanding those challenges. NATO has now adopted space as a new domain that it needs to consider in light of deterrence and defense. NATO is about to formally welcome its 30th member, North Macedonia. One more country, Spain, has yet to ratify that because they haven't had a government in the last year. That will happen. So NATO is strong. It's looking towards the future. That's the work. That's the good part. Needs to do more, needs to keep going faster, but that's the good part. The noise that we've heard over the last several days is about leaders having very public conversations about threats, about disagreements. You saw that with President Trump's press conference with President Macron. This is how NATO works through its political alliance, and it can be very messy and it can be very public, but that's actually its enduring strength. So yes, there are big disagreements, but this is how the alliance works through them. And I think the message to the Kremlin is we have dynamic conversations, but at the end of the day, we're a strong alliance.
There's also a lot of grumblings about Turkey's role in NATO. It appears there's a lot of leaders who think that perhaps Turkey does not entirely belong within that membership simply because of its closeness with Russia. How difficult is that conundrum, the Turkish problem?
So in some ways, Turkey, again, going back into NATO's rich history, Turkey has always been a challenging ally to NATO. And of course, it was so important when it was brought into NATO in 1952. It was because both Greece and Turkey were under enormous strain because of Soviet influence and interference. And now, as we see Turkey rethinking, quite frankly, its position regionally, I think it views itself much more as a Middle East and Eurasian power than it does a Euro-Atlantic power. And you're absolutely right. Growing Turkish-Russian relations, whether that's Turkey's purchase of the S-400 missile defense system in defiance of both the U.S. and of NATO, this will diminish, the closer that Turkey gets to Russia, it will diminish NATO's capabilities and opportunities for NATO to protect Turkey. This was one of the most divisive subjects with President Macron, and it continues to be a very divisive issue with the U.S. Congress. So you're absolutely right. This has been tough historically, but NATO has always worked through those challenges, and in fact, we saw them work through those challenges today.
So Ms. Connolly, what is your what is your assessment of this year's NATO summit? Are they prepared? Is NATO prepared for the next 70?
So again, this leaders' meeting demonstrates both the durability of this alliance and its military contributions. It also points to the transatlantic conversations that this alliance has had for the last 70 years. Some of them have been incredibly tough, and there are going to be 70 more years of incredibly tough political conversations. But at the end of the day, this alliance is now nearly at 30 members. It's just spending over $130 billion in defense dollars. This is a strong alliance. The politics are shaking, no doubt about it, but it remains strong and quite durable, and I think it transcends any one individual NATO leader.
That is very good to hear. Thank you so much. Ms. Heather Connolly, Director of the European Affairs Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Well, before we go, here's a name you may not have heard of in some time, Lech Walesa. He is the Polish electrician who organized the shipyard co-workers and led the Solidarity trade union movement, one of the forces that led to the fall of the Soviet Union. Walesa won the Nobel Peace Prize and eventually became Poland's first president, elected by popular vote. Now, while the threats facing the world may be different today, Walesa says not only is NATO's presence in the world necessary, it must evolve to deal with the geopolitical complexities of today and the future.
Forces like NATO will be needed, are needed today, and will be needed in the future. We have created so many potential dangers with our new technologies, some chemicals, that new unexpected disasters may occur, and forces like NATO will be needed to react to those.
And we'll leave you with that thought. That's all the time we have. Thanks for watching Plugged In.